Thank you. Thank you. Hi. I think it's been maybe 6 months since I last spoke, but honestly, I'm not really that sure. I mean, time has been passing by really quickly. I think way too quickly, but that's besides the point. Whenever I come up here to speak, I always feel a bit unprepared. And, I will admit, most of it is on me. I usually do less planning than I'd like, and this time is no different. If you saw me sitting on the right side of the room, you saw me writing my message as you were singing. But no matter how prepared I might be, I can never really shake the feeling that maybe I'm not exactly the best authority to be giving a sermon on a Bible character, much less one major character like Elijah. Are you guys familiar with the feeling where you know for a fact that there is so much to be said about a topic, but when it comes down to it, you have trouble getting it out? I struggle with this a lot, which is why I find it so important to have a set of notes or a guide for a message. I'm not one of those people that can come up with a whole thesis on the spot, at least not one that can say anything important. I will also admit that I was a bit worried about the time I would take giving the sermon, or more specifically, the worry that it wouldn't be long enough to have any real meaning. Seeing and listening to the people like Pastor Mark or Uncle Enrique makes me really appreciate how they've been blessed by God with the gift of speaking. But as I was writing out my message, I came to the realization that it doesn't really matter how long your message is. I know a lot of people that can talk for hours on end and say nothing of importance within those hours. What I think is important is to be able to get your message across with substance. Does that make sense? Maybe detail or relevance. As long as you can get the important parts of your topic across, the length of your message shouldn't matter. And I'm talking to you all as much as I'm talking to myself. But with that being said, I do think there is quite a lot to get across concerning the story of Elijah. Of all the 4 major and 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament, Elijah, and by proxy Elisha, is not actually seen in that list. As I'm sure you're aware, each of those 16 previously mentioned prophets all have their own books in the Bible. Now, something I wasn't actually aware of until now is that the term prophets, in the sense that we use today, the classification sense, generally describes the amount of written work that the individual left behind. Now, to my understanding, the Bible doesn't actually make any distinction between who was a major or a minor prophet. It's just something that we came up with to more easily categorize them. So the 4 major prophets, y'all know them? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, are all described as major prophets because of their extensive writings, and the other 12, which I'm sure you at least read their books at least once, they're pretty short. Joel, Amos, Obadiah have comparatively very little, but it's important to get the message across that our terms or our definitions of major and minor don't actually speak to their relevance in the Bible. They were all incredibly important, and this especially rings true for Elijah, being one of the 2 people that were taken to heaven while still alive on earth. Now, whenever I dive into a figure in the Bible, or frankly, any topic of interest, I like to fully grasp the circumstances of the figure and what was happening in the world around their time. It's important to note that the story of Elijah was written within 1st and 2nd Kings, a more historically focused section of the Bible rather than prophetic. Elijah was a Benjamite of the tribe of Benjamin during a time where the northern kingdom of Israel had long since split from Judah. At the time, Israel had been rule of king under king, with many of them doing wrong things under the eyes of the Lord. Most of the people had worshipped Baal, due in part to the influence of King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel. Jezebel, in particular, will be covered extensively in this lesson, as she was the main reason for the worship of Baal. For when she married Ahab, she essentially replaced their previous system of worship and persecuted any of the remaining remaining prophets of God. Elijah, whose name literally translates to Lord is my God, would have stood out from the start. It's a very bold name for a very influential figure. The Bible first introduces him prophesying over a drought over the land as recompense for the evil deeds of the king of Israel. If you'd like, you can just bring up the Bible and read along with me, as I'll be going through basically his entire story and all of the chapters in it. As 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1 reads, "And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word.'" God had commanded Elijah to go down by the brook and drink from there, where he would receive food from ravens for multiple days. And he did this without questioning, with absolute trust in God. After some time, however, the brook had dried up, obviously due to the drought over the land. And here in verse 9, God tells Elisha to arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. "See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you," which comes to a story that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, involving a widow and otherworldly amounts of flour and oil. Elijah arrives to Zarephath and sees a woman gathering sticks. He asks her to provide him with water and bread, to which she replies in verse 12, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." As we can see here, she planned for this meal that she was preparing for her and her son to be their last. Now, why then would Elisha ask this poor widow to give up what she thought would be the last meal she ever ate, all for him? It was a test of faith. Elisha promised the widow that if she were to prepare a meal for him, then her flour and oil would not dry out until the day the rain returned to the land. She did as he said, and lo and behold, her flour and oil never seemed to be empty. Elisha stayed in the widow's house, and after some time, the son had died from an illness. Now stricken with grief and anger, the widow had assumed that God sent Elisha here to judge her for her past sins and take her son away from her. We obviously know that wasn't the case, so when Elisha cried out to the Lord to let the wife return to his son, she was assuredly convinced that this man was God's servant. In this particular story, we actually see a small transformation in the form of the widow, in which she provides food for Elijah and is blessed after, not before, meaning her act was one of pure faith. But from here, Elijah is tasked with passing a message along to Ahab, leading to the confrontation at Mount Carmel. In the 3rd year of the famine, God had spoken to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 1, "Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I shall send rain on the earth." Now keep in mind, at this point, King Ahab had sent servants to every nation to look for and capture Elijah. So for Elisha to show up face to face with him shows how much trust he had in God and how much trust he was sure he'd be safe. Here in verse 19, Elisha tells Ahab to send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. This was a challenge to the gods that Israel had been worshiping, in which the prophets of Baal and Elijah, respectively, would go atop of Mount Carmel and prepare a sacrifice to their respective gods. Verses 23 and 24 read, "Therefore let them give us 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." With the people agreeing to the conditions, the prophets of Baal started their rituals. They tried everything from crying out loud to Baal to dancing around the altar for hours on end, and even bloodletting as a part of their sacrifice. But we know that nothing happened. Elijah then starts to prepare his altar, surrounding it with 12 stones to represent the tribes of Israel, and digging a trench around it to capture the 4 jugs of water that he would then pour on the altar. And I'll be reading his entire prayer, as I think it speaks for itself. Verses 36 and 37 say, "And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, 'Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant,
and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. The fire of the Lord had come down and consumed all that was in the altar, even the water in the trench. The onlookers at the mount saw that Elijah's God was indeed the true God, and seized the prophets of Baal at Elijah's command, where Elijah took them down and executed them himself. The drought that Elijah had foretold had come to an end, as he had shown King Ahab a distance of thundering clouds over the sea. Yet, despite this excellent show of dominance, I'd say, over Ahab, Elijah realized that his demonstration may not have had the intended effect. Ahab had told Jezebel about the events that transpired at Mount Carmel, and Jezebel had made a vow to keep up the worship of Baal and kill Elijah as he did to her prophets. Elijah, fearing for his life, ran to Beersheba. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4, Elisha says, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die, and said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" And this, I feel, is the lowest point in Elisha's spiritual journey. He had never felt despair like this, and he had gone so far even to wish for his own death. But knowing God in his powerful ways, he showed Elijah that there was still work to be done and that he was still with him. Sending an angel to provide Elijah with food and reassurance, Elijah made a 40-day journey to Mount Horeb. There he received instructions to anoint 3 individuals vital for correcting the injustices of the Israelites: Hazael to be king in Syria, Jehu to be king in Israel, and most importantly, Elisha to be prophet in Israel. God assures Elijah that there are 7,000 in Israel that still follow God, as to have him not lose hope. On the journey to anoint the other 2, Elijah met Elisha and recruited him to minister along with him. If we skip ahead to chapter 21, Elijah has another encounter with King Ahab. Ahab had asked for the vineyard of the Jezreelite Naboth, to which Naboth replied in verse 3, "The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you." Ahab was displeased and complained to Jezebel that he could not obtain the vineyard. Hearing this, Jezebel had created a nasty plot to kill Naboth and transfer over ownership of his vineyard to Ahab, which God obviously did not take kindly to. Elijah confronts Ahab again and prophesies the demise of Ahab and his bloodline. Verses 20 to 25 read, "So Ahab said to Elijah, 'Have you found me, O my enemy?' And he answered, 'I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring calamity on you. I will take away your posterity, and will cut off from Ahab every male in Israel, both bond and free. I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, because of the provocation with which you have provoked me to anger, and made Israel sin.' And concerning Jezebel the Lord also spoke, saying, 'The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. The dogs shall eat whoever belongs to Ahab and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the field.'" And in a surprising and uncharacteristic display of humility, Ahab tears his clothes and he repents before the Lord. In doing this, Ahab gains God's favor and lightens the sentence on Ahab, if only slightly, promising to reserve the calamity for him, or for his son, instead of him. Now, I think that's interesting within itself. Ahab is obviously a terrible king and even a more terrible person, but this display from a man that had done so much wrong still managed to move God's heart, even a little. It doesn't erase all of the horrible things that he had done in the past, and nor does it prevent from the calamity happening in the future, but God is able to give Ahab just a little solace before he passes. The rest of the accounts written in both 1st and 2nd Kings tell of Ahab's passing, as well as his son Ahaziah's passing, which are worth a read in their own right, but I felt there was a stronger display of Elisha's character past those accounts. course, I'm talking about the day where he was whisked up to heaven on a chariot of fire. Elijah and Elisha had been traveling together for quite some time at this point. On the way to Jericho, Elijah had tried to convince Elisha multiple times to stay behind. However, every time Elijah brought it up, Elisha had responded with the same thing. 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 4 reads, "Then Elisha said to him, 'Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho.' But he said, 'As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you.'" A fascinating man in his own right, Elisha had stuck with his teacher until the very end. Inspired by his works and his relationship with God, when Elijah asked for any one thing he could do for him before he was carried to heaven, Elisha asked for a double portion of his spirit. Verse 10 reads, So he said, 'You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so.' And as they continued to walk, Elijah is suddenly taken up in this chariot of fire and leaves behind his mantle for Elisha to carry on his ministry. But that's not where the story of Elijah ends. It's not even his last appearance in the Bible, as he appears with Moses during the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor in order to discuss the upcoming crucifixion. Now, the Bible never outright explains why Elijah was taken straight to heaven, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Enoch was ever explained either. But the thing is, I don't think we need to understand whether if it was just for his devotion to God or the plans that he still had for him. We have to understand that God's plans are perfect, even if we don't understand the reasoning behind them. And that more or less concludes the story of Elijah. He was a great prophet that undeniably changed the lives of an entire nation, and he was a man after God's own heart. Now, you may be wondering, if the theme is transformation, where does the transformation come in? And truthfully, I believe transformations happen all around him all throughout his story, whether it be the widow or Elisha or King Ahab. But Elijah's transformation, I think, was most clear at his lowest point of his life, while he was on the run from Queen Jezebel. It reminds us that while he was a great prophet that had the power to influence nations, at the core of it, he was still human like the rest of us. He still felt fear, he still felt doubt, he still felt shame. But despite his doubts, God had stuck with him through that hard time. In fact, he had never left. He was even granted an honor that not many in the Bible can say they can claim, being whisked to heaven alive. His story should serve as a reminder that no matter how low we go, there will always be a guiding hand to show us the right path. No matter how afraid we might be, no matter how we might stumble, if God was with Elijah, we should claim the promise that he'll be with us too.